Hey everyone, this week we're going to be looking at what I see as a false dichotomy in built environment artificial intelligence and how an idea called continuous improvement might help open up that dichotomy and create room for a third option. So this is an image of Songdo, Korea, a suburb of Seoul, which is sort of a prototypical greenfield smart city. Normally when I show this image, it's really haunting. There's so much density, built density, but then there doesn't seem to be human density to sort of match it. It feels empty, desolate, post-apocalyptic. Of course, now it feels a little bit more normal. It seems like everyone's just sheltered in place. I think this is actually a fairly familiar scene at this point. But I'm bringing this up again to kind of really reiterate that the smart city is a model of built environment artificial intelligence. It's a strategy around using sensors to record the inhabitants' usage, that then all that information could be potentially processed and then use as sort of fodder to have the city itself make decisions off of energy usage and other things like that to be a more sustainable, greener city. Unfortunately, this model has not proven effective yet. It's very much questionable whether this model is worth if the returns of this model are worth the significant investment in the billions of dollars that it has cost. So there's an alternative to this model, the smart city, a popular idea, one called civic hacking. This is a particularly popular idea among architects and designers, community planners, activists. It's a participatory model where people will actually interact with kind of a very loose, very base amount of digital infrastructure, digital data that the municipality would then present, and then different hacktivists would basically interact with that material to be able to create their own sort of digital improvements to the city that they sort of manifest themselves. It's a very collaborative idea. It's very grassroots. It's effectively the opposite of the totalitarian top-down developer-driven model of the smart city. This is a strategy that was effectively popularized by Anthony Townsend in his book, Civic Hacking. Antoine Pinson is also an advocate of the strategy, and there's some municipalities, typically more progressive ones like San Francisco, that are encouraging this kind of behavior, albeit it happens on a sort of a very short leash. It's not really a massive open all, take our data and manipulate it, but more of a here's data, let's see what you can do with it, and if it's something that seems to be fruitful, then we'll incorporate it back into the system. I'd say that the most successful civic hacks have actually happened without any sort of municipal participation whatsoever. I think an incredibly compelling example of civic hacking is Lee Persifield's Don't Flush Me. It was about approximately $20 of equipment, a very cheap cell phone connected with an Arduino chip, and then a series of lights installed in bathrooms. What Persifield observed was that in his neighborhood of Brooklyn, whenever there was rain of a certain volume, the sewers would get flooded, and the sewers would overflow. And effectively, any sewage that was then entered into the sewers would then go directly out into the harbor. What his mechanism did was basically determine when the sewers were at that sort of tipping point, and they would initiate lights in his friends' bathrooms that then they would be able to say, oh, okay, this is not a time to flush. Let's just let everything hang out here for a little bit, and then when the light is off, we'll flush later. It's a very ingenious idea. It's very, very clever. and incredibly sort of cost effective in terms of the amount of resources that was used, and then how much sort of environmental return came out of even just a small group of Brooklyn residents knowing it's not an advantageous time to be able to flush the toilet. And I think that in a way that project actually demonstrates why civic hacking hasn't exactly caught on or really taken hold at this point. It's very dependent on a few users creating something really cool that then they can replicate and share with lots of people. And this works on a very small scale, but it doesn't scale well. It doesn't actually kind of grow into sort of a larger municipal driven system that then could be implemented and deployed in any sort of scale. You can have a few people take on the user interface and a little bit of back-end work, but when you start dealing with the infrastructure needed for 100,000 people to use an app at the same time, it becomes actually an incredibly huge amount of work, and work that typically people don't want to volunteer to do. Usually that's work that people are incredibly well compensated for. So that element of scaling doesn't work well. Also, in this situation, the Don't Flush Me is kind of a self-contained system, right? You have someone who knows other people, and he shares this device, and they install the lights in their home. If this is a kind of a sanctioned app from the municipality's standpoint, there needs to be a quality assurance and quality control element of this. Basically, the municipality would have to ensure that people weren't hacking the system to mess with people, or to never have the light go off and people can't use their facilities. Things of that nature. It becomes really complicated. So effectively, the municipality would actually need to have a fairly robust team of people doing a lot of the work that volunteers would do in terms of the back end stuff that either come from municipality, and then there would also be a degree of oversight on it that is to date not feasible. So this idea of civic hacking is a very compelling idea. It's very romantic. It's sort of the people taking back their own city. Anthony Townsend cites it as being in the spirit of Jane Jacobs' idea of a city is for the people, and this is their own. They can take over the digital infrastructure and shape it in their own. It's great. The problem is that many people choose not to do that, or don't have the interest to do that at all. And to actually have it be more robust than just a handful of people with lights in their bathrooms, it actually requires quite a lot of infrastructure and investment that it's still unclear how that would be manifest. And I find myself wondering if hacking is really the right term here. Apologies to Keller Easterling. She has a beautiful piece that's advocating for the use of hacking. It's very compelling. It's incredibly seductive. But I personally find myself wondering if it's too subversive of a return. A hack denotes a questionable legality. A hack seems to be operating in kind of the gray area of condoned and uncondoned behavior. It doesn't necessarily suggest a community building as much as a community stripping down and disengagement. So I find myself having concerns about that in terms of this sort of almost edgy turn being shared with the masses and being hey, we're all going to be in our cool coffee shops building our infrastructure for each other. I'm not sure how plausible or meaningful that could be. When we think about the history of the term for hacking, either you're using a blunt force to crudely chop something, or in the sense of the MIT adoption of the term, which basically is a synonym for prank. It seems to me to be a degree culturally problematic to say, hey, this is exactly what we're going to do. We're all going to just hack the civic infrastructure that we have, and we're going to civic hack this. I'm somewhat unconvinced on this as kind of a overarching strategy of how urban scale artificial intelligence will reach anywhere between 4 and 8 billion people. Yeah, the slide's in the wrong place. Scalability is an issue, even when you have a disembodied hand in like an Oxford shirt drawing the arrow going up, and up is good. It's totally up, it's great, but scalability doesn't work with, or hasn't proven to work with civic hacking to date. So as I was kind of attempting to get my head around this sort of dichotomy between smart city and civic hacking, kind of figure out a way to sort of infiltrate or create a third option or some sort of mechanism that could kind of either balance the two or harvest from the both, or I found myself making effectively almost a value propositions of these kind of dichotomies that I found within the work that I've done so far in terms of arguing what this model could be and how it could actually work. I was working with these different dichotomies and making choices between them, and these are things that we've talked about in this class so far. There's issues with simulation, particularly when we're dealing with data sets this large. Effectively, brute force requires an insane amount of computation to be able to just play chess. Being able to simulate the actions or behaviors of an entire metropolis is simply something that has been debated in cybernetics and computer science as something that's actually achievable or not. I think it's important to point out that it's up for debate how many things can be simulated, and if everything can be simulated. That's very much a discussed topic. The idea of an adaptive system, one that you could place in a scenario and it could create responses to that, seems to be more viable than effectively a brute force method where simulations are created and then solutions are tested. Similarly, choosing a heuristic strategy over algorithms, this goes into what we were talking about last week with edge cases. A delivery drone can absolutely get from one neighborhood to another. We have no issue with that. Getting the drone to be able to identify the complexities of the urban environment of the actual building itself, to know what's a doorbell, what's not a doorbell, how to navigate intricate spaces to that degree and drop off a package safely. That is something that is proving difficult to code every kind of condition for. So rather than using an algorithmic strategy, which is to say, hey, we're going to anticipate every possible outcome and then develop a response to that, going with a heuristic strategy where effectively a learning process is engaged and the machine starts to learn and develop strategies rather than rules, that then it applies loosely to situations and tries to test which ones work better in given situations. Similarly to simulation, representing an environment is somewhat problematic, particularly when we're talking about human behavior over the course of a city, to privilege performance, how something does within a scenario, which is to basically allow a possibility for something to fail, saying, okay, this could do well, this not do well, we're going to see how it performs, and then we're going to try to nurture that performance rather than abstracting a scenario into a degree of representation and testing outcomes, very similarly to the the signalative issue, and then thinking of ideas over convenience over discipline. And this is effectively the Google idea. You encourage people to use something and you make it so convenient for them. You don't charge them anything. You make it really facile. You have sublime interfaces. But then you effectively monetize the usage of that device or that system as the kind of the mechanism that generates revenue and keeps the company going. Rather than forcing people to do something, requiring it, mandating it, simply saying, okay, hey, this is something you're going to want to use, or offering something as something you want to use, and then they can choose to engage with that or not. This is going into the Rosalind Williams idea of highways are a mechanism that limit freedom and limit choice by passing over many, many roads. However, the convenience of being able to go further faster prompts many users to choose that system over surface roads. So in terms of looking at these kind of value propositions and then trying to figure out how to manifest, apply them in some sort of system, I came across a systems thinker similar to Stavro Beery, is very much in kind of organizational management and strategy, a guy named Russ Ackoff, who is a really, really interesting thinker. He effectively, like Beer, was suggesting that there's degrees of complexity that are unfeasible to kind of deal with what he called analytically or scientifically, that looking at complexity as a system, as a kind of synthetic whole, and therefore looking at how the parts interact rather than trying to isolate the parts individually, understand how they work, and then put all those points back together, was a really helpful example for me in terms of thinking about, like, okay, are we only looking at the development of a single part, or are we looking at this kind of really robust system that has a whole bunch of parts that we look at individually as well? It seems to me that the Smart City and the Civic Hack are very much interested in sort of saying, okay, we're gonna look at discrete parts, whether the Civic Hacking is saying, okay, an individual will make one part of a whole larger system, and inherently, because that part is good, the whole system will be good. Whereas the Smart City is saying, effectively, if we take all of this information and we effectively break it down and understand aspects of it, then we will be able to understand the whole, and that will be good. Very much of them are based on the presumption that the system itself is not greater than the sum of its parts, and that any system can be broken down and understood through understanding each individual piece. This is the idea that was behind the book Challenger, which suggested that the Challenger disaster, everything went perfectly right, but there's a degree of chaos within the system that complex, where that inherently, even when every part goes right, the dynamics between the different parts can result in catastrophic failure because of the inherent complexity of the system. Ackoff describes this as well. The next clip is a video clip, and from here you guys are going to migrate from this video into a series of videos and other items on Learn. But note that this clip is incredibly, painfully, cringeworthingly dated. It is it's very difficult for me to watch. I'm guessing it's going to be similarly difficult for you guys to watch in parts. But I think Ackoff makes some really remarkable insights and describes the issue with systems thinking, or how systems thinking is manifest, in really interesting ways. And I would encourage you guys to look further into his idea of continuous development. It seems to me to be a very fruitful one, but it seems to be one that is very much untested when it comes into aspects of the built environment, despite the fact that Ackoff refers to architects and other practitioners in the built environment quite a bit. So go ahead and check out the clips after this. There's a little bit of a short essay at the end. Again, these tests are not part of your grade. They are just me trying to facilitate some sort of dialogue with you guys. The more you write, the more I'll respond. And I'll see you guys Thursday.